Hi, welcome to my project. The topic of my video is the interpretation of sedimentary rocks. So what is a sedimentary rock? In order to understand how we classify and explain different forms of rocks, we'll first need a basic understanding as to what sedimentary rocks are and where they come from. Sedimentary rocks are one of the three major rock groups: igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic. Igneous rocks are formed through melting and crystallization, and metamorphic rocks are formed under high pressure and temperatures in the deep crust of the earth. Sedimentary rocks are formed through surface processes, though, and unlike igneous and metamorphic rocks that form in the crust and upper mantle, sedimentary rocks are found at the Earth's surface and cover about 75% of it. They are the result of weathering, erosion, and deposition of sediment. The fragments of already existing rocks. Some examples of sedimentary rocks are chalk, limestone, sandstone, and clay. So how are they formed? Sedimentary rocks are formed through a multi-step process. First, weathering breaks down rocks and minerals of pre-existing rocks into sediment particles. As seen in photo A, physical elements over time, like wind, broke down this rock structure and created a hole in it. The rock that used to fill the hole are now the sediment particles. After weathering comes erosion. Erosion transports these sediment particles to deposition sites, which we will talk about in the next slide. The most common forms of erosion that move sediments are wind, water, and human activity. In photo B, we can see that sediments move down the hill either by gravity or wind or even possibly human activity and transport sediments from the top of the hill to the bottom. The last step to form sedimentary rocks is lithification, which is once enough sediment is deposited and builds up enough over time, lithification occurs. So lithification is the conversion of a loose sediment into sedimentary rock and happens through two processes: compaction and cementation. Compaction is when enough sediment builds up in the same area over time. The weight and the pressure of the new sediment above the old squeeze the particles together. Think of it as when you put sand on top of sand to build a sandcastle. The weight of what you put on top compacts with the sand and the water at the base, and eventually forms one large sandcastle, not a pile of loose sand particles. The idea is you're compacting a lot of small things together to make a big one. During this time, a large amount of the water that the sediment is usually found in or comes with is expunged or squeezed out, and the sediments bind together. The remaining water then helps us in the next step, cementation. Cementation binds the compacted sediment together to form the hard, solid rock we see. Fluid fills in the microscopic gaps in between the sediment particles and act as a glue or cement. The result? Sedimentary rocks. Next up, we're going to talk about the deposition area. As we know, after weathering comes erosion, and then through that, sediments are transported. Where they end up is called the deposition area. The deposition area, also sometimes called the environment of deposition, is where sediments originally form. Deposition is the settling and accumulation of sediments. As you can see in the image, the source area at the top right is where the process begins. Sediments in the form of rubble or gravel are weathered and eroded over time and transported through different types of agents, erosion, to the deposition area. The further from the source area the sediment is transported, the finer, smaller, and more rounded the sediment becomes. It is no longer large and jagged like the original rubble in the image. So what does all this tell us? Where sedimentary rocks are found, how they're formed can tell us a lot about their history, like how old they are, what environment of a location was like centuries ago, and what animals used to live or exist in that area. It can even give us insight into tectonic movement. Interpretation is a geographic term that means using a rock's characteristics and structures as indicators and clues to discover more about it and how the Earth has changed over time. In the next few slides, we will cover the basic ways in which geologists interpret rocks. There are many ways to interpret sedimentary rocks, and we're going to cover a few of the basic principles that help us out. The first is the principle of superposition in the first column to the left, and it simply states that sediments will layer on top of each other, creating a sequence with the oldest sediments at the bottom or base of the rock, and the newest are located near the top. This is pretty easy to understand, and it basically means that the sediment that got there first is obviously the oldest and will compact at the bottom, and then any newer or younger sediments will compile on top of that. Next, in the next column, the principle of horizontality says pretty much the same thing as the principle of superposition, but it also indicates that if the horizontal layers are tilted or have any type of curve or anything like that, the sedimentary rocks was once subject to tectonic movement and changes in plates. This can help geologists recognize shifts in tectonic plates over time if they compare tilting in sediment layers to the ages of the rocks. The next principle is the principle of inclusions, which tells us that if there are any rock fragments, so basically any other rocks or loose fragments that do not belong in the layer or are not part of the original sedimentary structure or are not even sedimentary rocks found in the layer, the fragmented rocks are older than the layer itself and were thus formed beforehand and were found in the environment beforehand. The final principle, all the way in the column to the right, that this lecture covers is faunal succession principle. It states that there is a well-defined order in which organisms have evolved over time. This is very self-explanatory and just states the obvious that some animals came before others, like dinosaurs came before chickens. The principle of faunal succession helps geologists determine sedimentary rock ages from the fossils found in them. As you can see in the photo in that column, they have used fossils over time to pinpoint when different parts of the rock structure were created, if they were created in maybe different time periods or different ages. So in addition to the principles, we have a few other clues we can use to tell us about sedimentary rocks. Bedding is a separation of sediments into layers by different textures, compositions, colors, etc. This is a cool trick nature does that produces some awesome tie-dye looking rock structures over time. Changes in any of these characteristics could indicate a couple of different things: a change in season, a change in climate, a change in waterway, and more. In addition to bedding, cross-bedding is when sediment particles are deposited by water at an angle and thus creates a more tilted effect. This could tell geologists about past water current flows, as the angle at which the sediment is layered could have been formed by the waterway it was found in. Another clue is mud cracks, which is when sediments are deposited, dry up, and crack. This usually happens when clay rocks that were once in water are now cracking in the absence of it. This tells geologists where possible waterways used to be that may have dried up or become shallow over time. So that is my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a lot about sedimentary rocks.